And welcome back to centralcoastradio.com. Well, there is this great series of films that have been shown in Melbourne called Unknown Pleasures, which is basically a celebration of Australian independent cinema. And the next film to be screened is on July the 18th, and it is called Call Me Mum, and it's from 2006 and directed by Margot Nash. Now, we thought we would actually get Margot on the phone today to chat a little bit about Call Me Mum, because we know a lot of our listeners out there like to head along to Unknown Pleasures. Margot, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So, Margot, tell us a little bit about Call Me Mum. Where did the journey first start for you with this film?
Well, the journey first started for me when I got sent the script and they were looking for a director. The writer, Kathleen Mary Fallon, had been writing this story, which is based on her personal story. It's a very personal sort of narrative for her. And she'd been working on it for a very long time, and she'd been inspired by the Alan Bennett monologues, because she thought, she's a writer, I don't know how to write a film script, but I can write monologues. And so she wrote this series of interlinked monologues. Well, first she wrote them as separate monologues, and then they became interlinked as one film. And so they were looking for a director to do this. So I got sent this script and I read it, and I couldn't put it down. I thought it was an extraordinary piece of writing and a very unusual story. It wasn't one that we'd really heard before. It was right in the middle of the whole stolen generation narrative back in the early 2000s. But this was a story written by a white foster mother about fostering a little boy, a little Indigenous boy, who was disabled from the Torres Strait Islands. And it's based on Kathleen's story, where she was working in a hospital in Brisbane, and this little boy, or it was a children's home, I think, she was brought in, and he was in a pretty bad state, and she decided, it's a long story short, she fostered him. And the film is about that story, about her fostering him. When the film takes place, it takes place on a plane where the character, who's based on Kathleen, her name is Kate in the film, played by Catherine McClements, wonderful Catherine McClements. She's got him, he's called Warren in the film, on a plane, and they're going up to Brisbane to meet his birth mother, who's very gravely ill in hospital. So that's where the story starts, and I started with the script, where I just went, wow, this is so unique. It's a very unique piece, and it's an unusual story. We don't usually hear from the foster mother. It's complex. It's beautifully written, and so I was very keen to do it, and I was lucky that they chose me.
It sounds like the script totally captivated you when you first read it. Was it the uniqueness that captivated you, or was it the fact that you felt this was a story that needed to be told?
I think it was the uniqueness.
Yep.
I'd never come across a script like that. I mean, I'd seen the Alan Bennett monologues, but they were single monologues. This was interlinked, and it was a very unique voice. I didn't know. I was aware of Kathleen Fallon's writing. She'd written a sort of cult novel, a lesbian cult novel called Working Hot, back in, oh God, what year did it come out? Probably back in the 80s.
Yep.
And I was aware of Working Hot, and I knew she had a very unique style, but I didn't know her story. You know, I didn't know that she'd fostered this little boy. When I was working on the film, I got to know him quite well, but he was in his 40s by that stage. He was an adult and living in Glebe in sort of assisted. He was living in a building that had a block of flats that had disabled people, and it was sort of assisted living. And but this is set back. The film is set at a particular moment in time. He was 17 and he was about to turn 18, and at the age of 18, he's an adult, But up until then, the department have the ability to remove him.
Yeah.
And if they found out that Kathleen was a lesbian, they probably would have taken him away. So she'd been keeping that quiet for a very long time. And she got, there's always this little bit from one of the monologues I've never forgotten where Kate says, "So I rang up my poor flatmate and I said, we have to get married. He said, can we talk about this when you get home? And I said, no, there isn't time." It's a great... So, and they did, and they brought him up. And, his foster father and Kathleen were involved with him for his entire life. He passed away about 5 years ago, had diabetes, unfortunately. But in the story, he's 17, turning 18, and he is full of longing to meet his birth mother, and she's in hospital, and she's full of dread about she's going to have to tell him what happened, or the true story of what happened. And there's a sort of the monologues are Kate, Warren, the boy, Flo, his Torres Strait Islander birth mother, played by Vicky Saylor, who's based in Townsville. She's a singer, and she sings the Torres Strait Islander songs that are in the film. She's got a great voice. And then there's these two other really, really tricky characters who are Kate's mother and father, who are sort of white racists, basically, in Brisbane, living in Brisbane. And so they're plotting to have him taken away because they think that it's terrible what she's done. And, so the tension in the story is the narrative of him. Will he be taken away? Won't he be taken away?
Yep.
And before he turns 18, because once he's 18, he's an adult. And yes, and because he's disabled, and this is true, Henry, whose character Warren is based on, he had when he was alive, had an intellectual disability, and he got very caught up with the whole narrative, the stolen generation, and he used to say, well, Kathleen, Kate, she stole me. Well, she didn't. She saved him. She rescued him from going to a really terrible institution where that's what they wanted to do, to put him in a dreadful place. And those institutions were ghastly. And,
Margot, before you read the script, how much did you actually know about the stolen generation? Because, of course, even people of my generation, we were never taught about it at high school. I didn't learn about it until my dad started working for the Royal Flying Doctors and the Aboriginal Health Services. How much of the stolen generation did you know when you first read the scripts?
Well, I actually knew quite a lot because I worked on a film in the late 70s, early 80s, 5-year project with 3 other women called For Love or Money. And it was a history of women's work in Australia. And we were a collective, and I was the film's editor. And that was a history of women's work in Australia from before white invasion. So we started with Aboriginal women's traditional work, and we brought it up to the present, which at that point was 1982. And so in telling that story, we told the story of the stolen generation because we did know about it. I mean, we're part of the independent film scene here in Sydney, and Alec Morgan had made an amazing film called Lousy Little Sixpence. I don't know if you've ever come across that. And he worked with an Aboriginal man called Jerry Bostock, and Alec is a real film archive, brilliant person. And sorry, I just got distracted. And so Lousy Little Sixpence, when kids were stolen, they were put in the homes. The girls were put into, the boys were put in. Anyway, they were sent to the homes, and they were paid sixpence a week. They were sent out to work. The girls went into service to do domestic labour and looking after children, and the boys were sent out to work on the cattle stations. But they were paid sixpence, and they never got their money. So it was called Lousy Little Sixpence because it was about the money that they should have been paid, they never got paid, would have been underpayment anyway for the work that they did. So we knew about that, and we tell that story in For Love or Money because we'd come across Lousy Little Sixpence. And just on a trajectory back, Lousy Little Sixpence came, I don't know if you've ever come across a film called Wrong Side of the Road.
I think I have, yes.
It's an Aboriginal road movie with two Aboriginal bands, No Fixed Address and Us Mob. And when they were making that film, and the Ned Lander, who directed that film, is part of our community, our documentary, our film community. I've known Ned for years. And Alec Morgan was working in the kitchen, in the catering for the bands, in that film. And they used to call him the Cookie Monster. And he would sit down with the old ladies and talk, and they told him about it. And so it came from Ned Lander and Graham Isaacs working with these young Aboriginal bands who were fantastic. And then the old ladies who were around the film shoot and who were interviewed and for the film shoot and everything, talking with Alex in the canteen, or not the canteen, on the the lunch breaks and things. And he went, I'm going to make a film about this. So he and Jerry Bostock did, and that's how people like me knew about it. And then we explored it further in For Love or Money, and we had long sequences in For Love or Money about because it was Aboriginal women's work. Those young girls were sent to work in people's homes and dressed up in dreadful, maids' outfits, and they kept running away. So we had a whole sequence about that came from the records of the research that the other women I'd worked with had done, with all the names and the dates, absconded and went back to her people, absconded and wasn't found, absconded. So the girls used to run away all the time and try and get home. So we knew all about it. And so when I read Call Me Mum, I thought, wow, this is a different take. Yeah. Because this is the authorities wanting to take a little Indigenous boy who's disabled away from a white foster mother who's trying to give him a life, because they didn't know she was a lesbian. If they'd known she was a lesbian, he would have gone. He would have been taken. So, but it was what she did, what Kathleen did was in the film, was that it's all very true, but it's also fictionalized. Yeah. So she wrote this stuff about her parents plotting, and because they knew she was a lesbian, they knew that he was disabled, and they thought it was, so the monologues of the parents are chilling, and they're fantastic. And so that sort of narrative of the stolen generation, it sort of layers into the very multi-layered nature of this film. But it's not your classic stolen generation story, because he wasn't stolen in the way that those Aboriginal kids who had some white blood in them were taken away, were thrown on the back of a truck. I think Charlie Perkins was one of those. And I certainly know, and I made a little film with this fellow who that happened to him up in Borroloola, and they took him down to Adelaide from Borroloola. He just woke up the next day or 2 days later and he was in Adelaide, and he'd been taken away from his parents. It's a different story. It's a much more complex and well, it's not more complex, but it's a very layered and complex story, and it's a tricky story because it's not clear cut.
Definitely. And Margot, I wanted to talk to you about the cast as well. You put together such an amazing cast for this film, led by Catherine McClements, who, of course, at the time was coming straight off Water Rats and Secret Life of Us.
That's right. Yes.
Tell us a little bit about the cast and how you were able to put this cast together.
Well, the producer, Michael McMahon, once I was on board, we had to raise the money. And he certainly worked very hard to make it happen, that we could get the money. Though we didn't get a huge budget to make it. I think at that point it was $700,000 for a feature, and it was made for television initially. So we did have money, and certainly, so I had I'd made a feature film before and I'd worked with a casting agent, and the casting agents come and they make a lot of suggestions, and then you meet people and you audition them, and I also had ideas for people, so I auditioned for quite a few people. I went to Melbourne because I live in Sydney, but it was being made in Melbourne and got Melbourne money, and so I went and lived in Melbourne for about 5 months, and but the hardest ones to cast, of course, were the Torres Strait Islander mother and the boy, because back in 2005, Torres Strait Islanders, we didn't know of any Torres Strait Islander actors. There were Indigenous, there were Aboriginal actors. I mean, Torres Strait Islanders are Indigenous, but we didn't know, and we knew we'd going to have to go and find them, because you can't cast Aboriginal actors as Torres Strait Islanders because they're culturally quite different. I mean, Torres Strait Islanders are islanders.
Yep.
They're not Aboriginal. It's a different culture. So Michael and I went on a casting trip, and we went to Mackay. And I think what happened was, advertisements were put in papers, and various Aboriginal organisations I didn't do any of that work. The producers would have done that, and there may be the casting agent too. And so people had responded. And the boy we actually cast was one of the first boys that we tested, Dane Christian, direct descendant from Fletcher Christian. And he was incredibly keen, and he did a great test. I thought, wow, and we never really found anybody who was better than him, and so he got cast. She was hard to cast, Flo, and we met Vicky in Townsville. She was a singer, and she did a very good test. But I wasn't, neither with either of them. You can't make a decision on the spot. You've got to see who's there. So we went to Cairns. We went to Brisbane. We went to Cairns. We screen tested, and then we went to Thursday Island in the Torres Strait, and we did a lot of tests, screen testing with for the old lady, for the mother, and the boy, and we didn't find anybody who performed as well in Thursday Island, but what happened in Thursday Island that was really, really interesting was we clarified some of the cultural protocols, and there was some stuff that Kathleen had written, and when we screen tested with those ladies, those women, those senior women, they went, no, that's not right.
Yeah.
Went, oh, ouch. So that was amazing. And Kathleen had been up there. She'd taken Henry, her real son, up to there, and he'd gone to meet his family, and she'd gone up there, and when she was writing, and done cultural consultation with a wonderful old man he died when I went up there. He'd gone, Ephraim Barney, who was very much involved in keeping alive Torres Strait Islander language and culture. And so Kathleen had opened up those networks for us too, because she'd already been there, because she's smart. She knew she had to do cultural consultation. And so we had some of those screen tests that I did were amazing, but the performances weren't right, but they were amazing in what they revealed to us about getting things right culturally.
Yep.
So we found,
Now, for all of our listeners sorry.
Well, that's all right, Con.
Yep. So for all of our listeners out there, if you want to head along and check out Call Me Mum, it is on July the 18th, and I've been told to warn everybody that this is at a little bit of an earlier time at 6:10 p.m. at the Thornbury Picture House at 802 High Street in Thornbury. Screening starts, as I said, a little bit earlier this time around at 6:10, so make sure you get along and check out this amazing film. Margot, to finish off, what would you like to say to people out there who are heading along to see Call Me Mum on the 18th of July?
Well, I'll be there, and Kathleen, the writer, will be there, and Michael McMahon, the producer, will be there. And this is my second time screening at Unknown Pleasures. I think it's a really great initiative by Bill Masoulis and Chris Luscree, and I think they're both terrific and very interesting sort of cinephiles and filmmakers. And so I think the conversation after the film will be very lively and interesting. And because the thing about Unknown Pleasures is that they always have a good Q&A afterwards. It's probably why they're starting a bit earlier, because they're wanting to allow a bit more time for the Q&A afterwards. So we'll all be there, and there'll be a great Q&A, I hope, afterwards. And I think the film it's different. It's unusual, and the monologues, I think, are very special because in a lot of films that we see, there's subtext under the surface, but in the monologues, it's right there on the surface. People are confiding in you, the audience, and they tell their secrets. And so you have, as the audience, have to work to put all those stories together to really work out what happened. So it's a challenge.
Definitely. Well, again, for all of our listeners out there, if you want to head along and see Call Me Mum, it is on July the 18th at 6:10 p.m. at the Thornbury Picture House in High Street, Thornbury. And I've just been told bookings are absolutely essential, so get onto the thornburypicturehouse.com.au website and book your ticket right now. Margot, thank you so much for taking the time to chat to us today. It's been an absolute honour having you on the show, and I hope a lot of our listeners head along and check out this very important film.
It's my pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for asking me to come on. Okay.